All right, everybody, this is 4.2 intercepts. So we're talking about x-intercepts and y-intercepts. So x-intercepts is where a line crosses the x-axis, and the y-intercept is the same but with the y-axis. Okay, so if we look at example 1, the x-axis is this line, and we want to know where it crosses with this blue line. Okay, so this is the x-intercept, and I'm going to ask you to write these as an ordered pair. So the x value is -3, and the y value is 0. So we'll write that as an ordered pair. Okay, you'll be asked to do that in our next, in secondary math 2. So I just want you to get ready all about it, so you're not having to make that change later. Okay, and then our y-intercept is where it crosses the y-axis, so that's right there, and we'll also write it as an ordered pair. So in the x direction, it's 0, and in the y direction, it's 3. Okay? Alright, pause and give this one a try. Alright, so we should have negative, or sorry, not negative, what am I saying? 7, 0. Okay, so in the x direction, it's 7, and in the y direction, it's 0, and then the y-intercept that has an x value of 0 and a y value of -2. Okay, we will skip this one. The reason why, just because the x-intercept isn't a nice point, and you can estimate, but you won't have one where it's not a nice point. So let's talk about this one. So our x-intercept, okay, where does it cross the x-axis? And you'd say, well, Mr. Warner, it doesn't, and you'd be correct. So we would say none. There are no x-intercepts. And then for the y-intercept, it crosses at 5. So it would be 0 in the x direction and 5 in the y direction. Okay? So again, all ordered pairs are x and then y. Okay, so that hopefully that's not too bad. Just like our last problem, I feel like people do a lot better when you have the graph. But we'll also have some where we'll have the equation, and I'm going to ask you to find the y and x intercepts. Okay? So this is kind of like your key, but let's just talk about it here. Okay? So if we're trying to find the x-intercept, what do we know about the y value of it? Okay? It's always 0. And if we're trying to find the y-intercept, we know that the x is always 0. Okay? So we're going to use that to be able to find the missing, or to find the intercepts, I should say. Okay? So let's start with the y-intercepts, because I think it's the easiest. So if you're trying to find the y-intercept, set x equal to 0 and solve for y. The nice thing about this form, slope-intercept form, is that this is your y value for your y-intercept. Okay, so the intercepts the y-axis at 5. So the ordered pair here would be 0, 5. Okay. If you followed like this instructions, we would plug x in, or 0 in for x, and we'd end up getting y equals -0 plus 5, and you end up just getting y equals 5. Okay, so that's the same thing. So you can do that for any type of equation, but when we have slope-intercept form, the constant is always your y-intercept. So y-intercept here would be 0, 15. Okay, and then let's look at C. The y-intercept would be 0, 3. So it's super easy to find the y-intercepts. So now let's talk about finding the x-intercepts. And I've had students say, well, if we look at this problem, my guess is the x-intercepts is 5. And you'd be wrong, because that's the slope. The slope and the x-intercept are not the same thing. So if we're trying to find the x-intercept, we're going to set y equals 0 and then solve. So we have our equation, we set y equals 0, so we substitute 0 in for y, and then we just need to solve for x. Okay, so in class a lot of students started by saying, well, we could subtract 5 to both sides, which would be great. Okay, and then we don't want to know what negative x, we want to know what positive x is. So we could divide both sides by a -1, and we get x equals 5. And then we just want to write down our ordered pair. So this would be 5, 0. This would be our x-intercepts. Okay. So if you're trying to find the x-intercepts, set y equal to 0 and solve. So why don't you pause and give this one a try. So we set y equal to 0, we solve. Okay, so we subtract both sides, and then we divide both sides by 5. So we get x equals -3. So our ordered pair would be -3, 0. I would love it if you box your answers so they're easy to find. Okay? Alright, the last thing, this one's a little different because, well, what's the difference between them? Maybe, well, we have negative here, negative. We had a negative here, but we also have a fraction, which we haven't had a fraction yet. So let's talk about C. Same sort of thing though, you set y equal to 0. Okay. And then we'll try and get x by itself. So you start the same way, we would subtract 3 from both sides. Okay, but now this is the part that's maybe a little different. So we still want to kind of take off those layers. This is kind of like an onion, you just kind of want to take off a layer bit by bit. The next thing that we'd maybe want to get rid of is this 4. It's dividing something, so its opposite would be to multiply. So we could multiply both sides by 4. And then we do the same step that we did last time, is this is being multiplied, so we would divide both sides by that -3. So x would be equal to 4. So our ordered pair would be 4, 0. Okay, so that's basically it. D and F are almost the same as C. E is a little different, so let's make sure that we're good with this. So we've talked about how this is all y equals mx plus b. So it looks like we're missing something here. What would that be? You're right, so it would be this constant that would be 0. So our y-intercept here would have to be 0, 0. And then if we want to find our x-intercept, we set y equals 0. And then we'll solve for x. So we divide both sides by 2, and would end up just getting x equals 0. So our x-intercept would be 0, 0. So this graph, if you were to graph it, it has a y-intercept of 0, and then goes up 2 over 1, and it continues that same slope. So that's why our x-intercept is the same as the y-intercept, because they both cross those axes at 0, 0. Okay? Alright, last thing that we can talk about is a word problem. I have this kind of guided for you, so it's not like all thrown at you at one time. We'll have a lesson on word problems, but we're kind of going to sneak into this just a little bit. So it says Kelly bakes 265 cookies for her bake sale. She sells an average of 32 cookies every hour. So I already have the equation here, so you don't have to really worry about writing an equation. We'll get into that later. But from that equation, which is the slope and which is the y-intercept? Well, you'll probably just look at the equation and say, oh, it's negative 32 because that's what's in front of your x. And then this must be your y-intercept, so 0, 265. Okay. From the equation, we should also be able to come up with the slope and y-intercept. We know this is the slope because it uses words like every hour or things that change over time. Okay. Changes over time. Okay. And then we know this is our y-intercept because that's the initial amount. Okay. And then they don't tell you that the slope is negative 32, but we know that it's negative because she's selling them, she's giving them away. She's getting money, but she's losing cookies. Okay. So the amount of cookies she's getting is getting smaller over time. So that would be like a negative slope. Okay, so then C just wants to know what is the time when she runs out of cookies. When does she run out of cookies? And that's the same as asking for the x-intercept. And we know that if we're trying to find the x-intercept, we know that y has got to be equal to 0. So we'll substitute that in. And we'll just solve. So same steps, we'll always add or subtract first. So negative 265 is equal to negative 32x. And then we want to get rid of that negative 32. It's being multiplied, so we'll divide. And we'd get x is equal to, I think it's about 8. I don't have my calculator with me, but I'm pretty sure it's like 8.26. Okay, and that would be like hours. So if you wanted to write down the x-intercept, it would be 8.26-ish, 0. So this is saying that after that many hours, she has that number of cookies. Okay. All right. If you'd like to give that one a try, go for it. It's basically the same. Again, that's like our slope. That's our y-intercept. We can solve for the x-intercept if we set y equal to 0 and solve. Okay. All right. If you have any questions, stop by. I'd love to help you out. We'll see ya.